Hey, we're going deep on something that you really don't want to ignore, and that is SQL injection risks. You're probably here because website security, that matters to you, but like who wants to like wade through all this technical jargon to really understand it? So don't worry, that's why we have our expert here today. They're here to like break it all down for us and, give us some really clear, actionable takeaways.
Yeah.
So think about it like this. Your website, it's a locked house, right? You wouldn't just leave a key under the doormat, would you? No way.
Yeah.
So SQL injection, it's kind of like finding that hidden key, and we're going to show you exactly how hackers do it, and more importantly, how you can like lock your site down.
Yeah, I love that analogy. So in like the simplest terms, SQL injection, it's a way for hackers to kind of trick your website into thinking they're a legitimate user, right?
Yeah.
Which could give them access to, well, all sorts of sensitive data.
Yeah. And you might be thinking, oh, I'm just a small business. I'm not a target. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Smaller sites, those are often targeted because hackers kind of see them as like easier wins. It's like they're going for the low-hanging fruit, thinking that security might not be as tight.
Exactly. And smaller sites can actually be seen as stepping stones to like larger networks too. So if a hacker, if they can compromise your site, they might be able to use that access to then go after like your partners or your clients. And that creates this ripple effect that you just don't want.
Right, right. And what's even more concerning is that even a basic SQL injection attack, you don't need to be like some master hacker to do it. Like it's more accessible than you might think.
Yeah, for sure. With just a little bit of coding knowledge, someone could launch an attack like this, which I think is one of the reasons why SQL injection is still one of the most common hacking methods out there, even though it's been around for ages.
Yeah, it's unsettling how common these attacks are. So
Yeah.
can you kind of walk us through how one of these attacks might happen? Like what's a typical target?
Sure, yeah. Let's take the common search bar. It seems harmless enough, right? You use it to find information on a website. But it can actually be a direct line to your website's database.
So you're saying like this simple act of me searching for something could open me up to an attack? I honestly never would have thought of that.
Yeah. It all comes down to what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So when you type something into that search bar, your query, it gets sent to the database in the form of an INCL command. And hackers can exploit this by entering, malicious code instead of just a regular search term.
So instead of like searching for, say, best hiking boots, they might enter something sneaky that's going to try to exploit that database.
Exactly. So imagine someone enters like a simple query, something like this, 1-1, drop table users. This could actually tell the database to delete your entire user list.
Wow, that's scary to think about. It seems like such a small thing typing into a search bar, but the impact could be enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. And search bars, they're often targeted because they're so common. Plus, they interact directly with databases, and they may not always have the same level of security as other parts of a website.
All right, this is serious stuff, but let's get practical. What are the real-world consequences of a successful SQL injection attack? Like, why should website owners be losing sleep over this?
Well, the impact, it can be absolutely devastating. Imagine losing all of your customer data or having your entire website defaced. We're talking about financial losses, legal headaches, damage to your reputation, and it can be so difficult to repair.
Yeah, and we hear about massive data breaches all the time. So
Right.
were any of those actually caused by SQL injection?
Oh, yeah, they definitely were. Remember when LinkedIn was hit back in 2012? Hackers used a SQL injection to compromise millions of passwords. And the Sony PlayStation Network suffered a major breach in 2011, partly due to SQL injection, and that led to the theft of millions of user accounts and a ton of personal information.
Oh, wow. Those are huge companies, though, right? Does this really happen to smaller websites?
It does, it absolutely does, and the impacts can actually be even more devastating for them. I mean, a data breach could cripple a small business both financially and in terms of reputation. Recovering from something like that is incredibly challenging. I mean, think about it. Would you continue to do business with a company that lost all of your personal data?
Probably not. So it's not just about the immediate damage, it's about the long-term impact on trust and credibility. Okay, we've kind of painted a pretty bleak picture here. So let's shift gears and talk about solutions. What are some actionable steps that website owners can take to protect themselves?
So one of the most effective methods is called parameterized queries. Now, it sounds complicated, but the concept is pretty straightforward.
Can you break it down for me? What exactly are parameterized queries and how do they help prevent these attacks?
Sure. So think of it like setting really strict rules for your database. So instead of directly inserting the user's input into a query, which is where the vulnerability lies, you use placeholders. So let's say you have a query like this. Select from users where username.
Okay, and that's looking for a specific user in the database.
Exactly. But notice how the username variable is directly in the query. That's where the hacker can inject malicious code. So with parameterized queries, you would change that to something like select from users where username equals it. The actual username is sent separately, so it's treated as data, not code.
So it's kind of like telling the database, hey, this is the blueprint for what you should be looking for, and here's the specific data to plug in. That way, even if a hacker tries to slip in some malicious code, it just gets treated as text, not an actual command.
You got it. That's exactly how parameterized queries work to neutralize the threat.
That's a great example. So what else can we do to kind of bolster our defenses against these attacks?
Well, input validation is another super important step. It's kind of like checking your mail before you open it. You're essentially making sure that only the expected type of data is allowed in two specific fields on your website.
So if a field's supposed to be for, say, a phone number, it would automatically reject any input that includes letters or symbols.
Exactly. It helps prevent hackers from being able to inject malicious code disguised as regular text. You're basically setting boundaries and filtering out anything that looks suspicious.
Okay, so we've got parameterized queries and input validation. What else should be on our security checklist?
Well, another technique is called escaping user inputs. And this basically involves neutralizing any potentially dangerous characters in the data that users enter to prevent them from being misinterpreted as commands by the database. It's like putting those characters in quotation marks so the database knows to treat them as just plain text, not actual instructions.
Ah, that makes sense. So we're essentially disarming those characters before they can cause any trouble. So what other security measures should we be aware of?
Then there's limiting database permissions. And this is all about granting just the bare minimum access that's needed for each user or application that interacts with your database. Think of it like giving out keys to your house. You wouldn't give everyone a key to every room, right?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Only those who need access to specific rooms should have the keys.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to your database. By limiting permissions, you're basically containing the potential damage even if a hacker manages to break in.
So it's kind of like having a series of security checkpoints throughout your website, right? And that makes it much harder for attackers to kind of move around freely, even if they manage to breach one area.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about creating a layered defense system.
Yeah. These coding techniques sound like they can create a pretty robust fortress around our data. But do they require advanced coding skills to implement?
Well, you don't need to be a coding wizard to implement these measures. A basic understanding of the concepts and good communication with your developers can go a long way.
That's good to know. It sounds like understanding the risks and having open communication with your web development team, those are crucial. Is there anything else that website owners should be thinking about beyond these coding strategies?
Absolutely. Defensive coding is a great foundation, but there are other measures you can take to further strengthen your website's security. It's not just about the code itself, it's about having a holistic approach to security. Kind of like securing your home, you wouldn't just rely on like a strong lock on your front door, right? You probably have an alarm system, motion sensors, maybe even a security camera or two.
Yeah, okay, so it's about having multiple layers of protection and not just relying on a single point of defense. That makes a lot of sense. So what are some of these additional security measures that we should be considering?
Well, one of the most important things is to regularly update your software and database systems. Think of those update notifications like free security upgrades. They often include patches that fix known vulnerabilities, including ones that could be exploited by SQL injection attacks.
So those update notifications are more than just annoying pop-ups. They're actually crucial for our security.
Exactly. Don't ignore them. They're like getting a free security system upgrade. Another essential layer of protection is a web application firewall, or WF for short.
Okay, I've heard of those, but I'm not entirely sure what they do. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So think of a WAF like a security guard standing at the entrance to your website, screening visitors for any suspicious activity. They can actually detect and block malicious traffic before it even reaches your database. And a lot of WAFs come with built-in SQL injection protection, which makes them a really valuable addition to your security setup.
So it's like having an extra layer of protection, a digital bouncer, to keep the bad guys out.
That's a great way to put it. WAFs are your frontline defense against a variety of web-based attacks, including SQL injection.
Okay, so we've got updates and firewalls. What else should we have on our radar?
Well, regular security audits and penetration testing are also essential. These are kind of like taking your website to the doctor for a checkup to help you identify and fix vulnerabilities before hackers can exploit them.
So it's not just about setting up these security measures and then forgetting about them, right? We need to regularly assess and update our defenses.
Exactly. Think of it as preventative maintenance for your website. Just like how regular health checkups can help you avoid major health problems down the road, security audits and penetration testing can help to keep your website safe and healthy.
That's a great analogy. Are there any other often overlooked security measures that we should be thinking about? I'm starting to feel like website security is a never-ending task.
It's definitely an ongoing process, yeah, but don't let that discourage you. Small steps can make a big difference. One often overlooked area is error messages. You want to avoid giving hackers any unintentional clues about your database structure.
So we shouldn't be displaying detailed error messages that could potentially reveal sensitive information.
Right. Keep error messages general and don't give away more information than necessary. And finally, one of the simplest but most effective things you can do is to try to minimize the storage of sensitive data whenever possible.
I like that. If you don't have it, you can't lose it.
Exactly. If you don't need to store certain data, don't. And if you do need to store sensitive information, make sure it's properly encrypted.
Okay, that makes sense. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about what SQL injection is, why it's a threat to websites of all sizes, and we've outlined a pretty comprehensive checklist of security measures to help protect against it.
Yeah, and we've also touched on the importance of taking that holistic approach to website security, going beyond just code to implement multiple layers of protection.
It's been a really insightful conversation so far. But we'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into SQL injection, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive. So before the break, we were talking about just how widespread these SQL injection attacks really are. And, we mentioned a couple of big names, LinkedIn, Sony, but it seems like every week there's news of like another data breach. So are there other examples that kind of drive home that real-world impact of this, especially for those of us who aren't running these giant corporations?
Oh, absolutely. SQL injection, it's not just a theoretical threat. It's a very real problem that businesses and organizations of all sizes face, constantly. Back in 2015, the UK's Talk Telecom, they were hit by a major attack, and hackers used SQL injection to get their hands on personal data from millions of their customers. The financial and reputational damage was huge.
Wow. Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that this is like a global issue. It's not just limited to these few high-profile cases.
Exactly. And it's not just about like the size of the company either. Even organizations that are known for their security, they can be vulnerable. Back in 2011, a group that called themselves LUDSEC, they made headlines by using SQL injection to target all sorts of organizations like Fox.com and even the CIA's website.
Wow, if they can preach the CIA, that really highlights how persistent these hackers are.
Yeah, for sure. It goes to show that no one is immune in security. It's an ongoing battle. As security measures become more sophisticated, hackers are constantly finding new ways to exploit those weaknesses. So that's why it's so crucial to stay informed about like the latest threats and the best practices.
Yeah, it really sounds like understanding SQL injection, it's not just for tech experts. It's essential for anyone who has a website.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
The more you understand about these risks, the better equipped you are to protect your website and your users' data.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and dive into some of the more technical nuances of SQL injection. We talked about how these attacks work in general, but I'm curious to learn more about like the different types of SQL injection attacks. Is there like a whole taxonomy of these things?
There is. There are actually several different types of SQL injection, each with its own methods and characteristics. One common type is called in-band SQL injection. It's essentially like a direct attack. So the hacker uses the same communication channel to both inject the malicious code and then retrieve the results.
So it's like using the front door to both break in and steal the goods. What are some examples of how this in-band injection actually works?
Sure. So two common techniques are union-based and error-based injection. So union-based injection takes advantage of the union operator in SQL. That operator, it's used to combine the results of multiple queries. And hackers, they can exploit this by crafting a malicious query and using the union operator to kind of sneak it in with a legitimate query. And this allows them to retrieve data that they shouldn't have access to.
So it's like sneaking a fake item onto a shopping list. It blends in with the real items, and gets past the cashier.
That's a great analogy. And then there's error-based injection. This technique is a bit more devious, so the attacker will intentionally trigger database errors to try to extract information. They craft queries that are actually designed to cause the database to kind of reveal sensitive information in its error messages.
So it's like tricking the database into revealing its secrets by making it slip up.
Exactly. They're exploiting the database's error handling mechanisms to their advantage. Now, those were both examples of direct attacks. But there's also a more subtle approach called blind SQL injection. So with this method, the attacker doesn't get direct access to the data, but they can still extract sensitive information.
How do they do that if they can't actually see the data?
Well, it's all about deduction and observation.
Mm-hmm.
The attacker will send queries that are designed to kind of elicit different responses from the website depending on whether a certain condition is true or false. They're looking for these subtle clues in the way the website responds.
Oh, so it's more like a game of 20 questions than a direct assault.
Exactly. By carefully crafting their queries and observing the website's behavior, they can kind of piece together sensitive information bit by bit.
Wow. That sounds like a lot of work for the hacker. Why would they go through all that trouble with this more subtle approach?
Well, sometimes blind SQL injection is necessary when those more direct methods are blocked by security measures. It can also be a way for them to avoid detection. These attacks, they're much more subtle and might not trigger the same alarm bells as a more blatant attack.
So it sounds like we need to be just as wary of these kind of subtle attacks as the more direct ones. Are there any other types of SQL injection that we should be aware of?
Yeah, there's one more worth mentioning. It's called out-of-band SQL injection, and this one's a bit more advanced and a lot less common. It involves actually using the compromised database to communicate with, external systems.
So instead of stealing the data directly, they're using the database to send it somewhere else.
Exactly. It's a stealthier way to exfiltrate data and can even allow hackers to bypass firewalls and other security measures.
That's incredibly sneaky, but it also sounds very complex to pull off.
It is. Out-of-band injection, it requires more skill and knowledge than the other types that we've discussed. But it's still a threat that, security professionals need to be aware of.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that there's a whole spectrum of these SQL injection attacks, from these direct assaults to the more subtle, indirect approaches. It's almost like a choose-your-own-adventure for hackers.
That's a good way to think about it. But the good news is that a lot of the defensive techniques that we talked about earlier, like those parameterized queries and input validation, they're effective against a pretty wide range of these different injection methods.
So rather than trying to play whack-a-mole with every single attack type, we should really focus on building a robust defense system that just makes our websites less appealing targets overall.
That's the key takeaway here. It's about making your website a fortress, not a welcome mat for hackers.
That makes a lot of sense. But I have to admit, all this, it's still a little bit overwhelming, right? There's just so much to consider. And I'm no security expert. So where should I focus my efforts if I'm, just starting to think about my website security?
That's a great question, and it's a common one. You don't have to become a security guru overnight. Just start with the basics. Focus on those, core defensive coding techniques that we discussed, like parameterized queries, input validation, and regular software updates.
Those are the big three,
Right.
like the foundational elements of a secure website.
Absolutely. Implementing those will significantly reduce your risk of being compromised.
Yeah, it sounds like those three measures could really stop a lot of these attacks in their tracks.
Exactly. They address many of the common vulnerabilities that hackers try to exploit. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are tons of resources available online, and there are security professionals that can, help guide you through the process.
So if I'm feeling lost, I could always reach out to my web developer, my hosting provider, or even a security consultant for help.
Exactly. Security is a team effort. Don't be afraid to reach out to those who have more experience in this area.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the anatomy of a SQL injection attack, the devastating consequences of a breach, and a whole range of defensive strategies that we can use to keep our website safe.
Yeah, and we've explored the alarming prevalence of these attacks, the different types of SQL injection hackers use, and the importance of taking that holistic approach to security that goes beyond just the code itself.
It's a lot to take in, but I'm honestly feeling much more informed and empowered now.
That's great to hear. Our goal was to really demystify this topic and make it accessible to everyone, regardless of their technical background.
And I think you've definitely done that. Understanding SQL injection risks, it's not just for the techies out there. It's really a must-have for anyone with a website.
Absolutely. It's all about taking control of your online presence and protecting yourself and your users.
And the good news is that by taking some proactive steps, we can significantly reduce our risk.
Exactly. It's about being aware, being prepared, and taking action to secure our online world.
Awesome. Such great insights. But we'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive into SQL injection with some final thoughts and takeaways, so stay with us. Welcome back to the deep dive. We spent this whole episode exploring the world of SQL injection, and I really hope you're walking away feeling more informed and empowered rather than intimidated. Understanding those threats, that's the first step to really taking control of your website's security.
Absolutely. That's exactly the goal here. We're not trying to scare you. We just want to give you the knowledge and the tools you need to make, really smart decisions about protecting your online presence.
So let's bring it all together. If there was like one key message you want our listeners to remember from this deep dive, what would it be?
Well, SQL injection, it's a real and constant threat, but it's not an unbeatable one. With a little awareness and some effort, you can significantly reduce your risk.
It's about being proactive, right?
Yep.
Not waiting until you're already dealing with a breach.
Exactly. Preventing an attack, it's always easier than cleaning up the aftermath. And the steps that you take to protect against SQL injection, well, those are going to benefit your website's overall security, too. It's like building a strong foundation for a house.
Right. It's a win-win. Stronger security and peace of mind.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, I want to challenge our listeners to take action. Think about your own website. What's one thing that you can do today to improve your defenses against SQL injection?
It could be something as simple as like reaching out to your web developer and just asking them, hey, are you guys using parameterized queries in your code? Or maybe it's finally setting up that web application firewall that you've been putting off.
Yeah, even small steps can make a big difference, right? So don't get overwhelmed trying to do everything at once. Just start with one concrete action and kind of build from there.
And remember that security, it's an ongoing journey. It's not a destination. Technology is always evolving, and so are the threats. So stay informed, stay vigilant, and you'll be well ahead of the curve.
Great advice. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into SQL injection. We hope you found it informative and, most importantly, empowering. So until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep learning